You hear the name Hamas all the time, right? It's constantly in the news. But what does it actually represent? To really get past the headlines, we're going to dive into the source documents that actually detail its origins, its ideology, and, of course, its actions. So let's start by unpacking the different ways this organization is seen. And this, right here, gets to the very heart of why this topic is so incredibly complex. Is Hamas a resistance movement? Is it a political party? Or is it a terrorist group? You see these conflicting labels everywhere. So our goal here is to dig into the source material and see how Hamas actually defines itself, not just through its words, but through its documented actions. All right, so let's start with the absolute fundamentals. According to the documents we're analyzing, what exactly is Hamas? Okay, so its full name, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, literally translates to the Islamic Resistance Movement. The source documents we've reviewed define it as a Palestinian, Sunni, Islamist organization that's both political and military. And it's important to note it is officially designated a terrorist organization by a lot of countries and international bodies, including the United States, the European Union, Canada, and Israel. Now, the event that really brought all of this into such sharp global focus was the attack on October 7th, 2023. The source materials document a just staggering level of violence. Over 1,200 people killed in a single day. And the vast majority of them were civilians. And it wasn't just the killings. The documents also record that more than 250 hostages, we're talking children, women, the elderly, were taken from Israel and brought into Gaza. And let's be crystal clear about this. Under the Geneva Conventions, the act of taking civilian hostages is explicitly defined as a war crime. To really understand the why behind these actions, we've got to go back to the very beginning, to the group's founding. What is the core ideology that drives Hamas, according to its own foundational documents? So this whole thing didn't just appear out of nowhere. This timeline traces its evolution. It actually started out as the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and its focus was on social services. But then, a huge shift happened during the First Intifada. That was a period of a widespread Palestinian uprising. And in 1987, Hamas was officially founded as a militant organization. Just 1 year later, it released its charter, a document that laid out its worldview and its goals for everyone to see. This is probably the single most cited sentence from that 1988 charter. It's really important to see what this isn't. It's not a call for a political settlement. It's not a call for a two-state solution. The document frames the group's entire purpose as the eventual total obliteration of Israel. Diving deeper into that 1988 charter, a few core ideas really stand out. First, it completely rejects peace negotiations, calling them a betrayal of God. It says armed struggle, or jihad, is the only solution. The source analysis also points out the charter's use of anti-Semitic tropes, including blaming Jewish people for world wars. And finally, it declares that all of historic Palestine is an Islamic waqf, which is like a sacred trust that can never ever be negotiated away. Okay, so you've got this incredibly uncompromising charter as your guidebook. How on earth does that kind of movement end up becoming a governing power? Well, that story unfolds with the takeover of Gaza. Well, the path to power, as laid out in our sources, was basically a three-step process. First, in 2006, Hamas wins legislative elections. A big part of that was capitalizing on public anger with the ruling Palestinian Authority. But just 1 year later, they executed a violent coup, literally throwing their political rivals from the Fatah Party out of Gaza. And ever since, they've run an authoritarian regime there, crushing political dissent. This slide shows a really critical shift described in the source material. You see, the group's initial focus on social services, known as dawah, was eventually overshadowed by something else entirely. The sources state that resources, and that includes a lot of international aid, were increasingly diverted away from civilian needs and poured into building military infrastructure, like that massive, infamous tunnel network and stockpiles of smuggled weapons. So this brings us to the strategy Hamas actually uses from its stronghold in Gaza. The documents we analyzed describe it as a kind of double game. Let's break down what this dual strategy actually looks like, as presented in the sources. The public message is often one of heroic resistance, but the tactic on the ground involves indiscriminate rocket fire on civilian areas. The stated goal might be defending civilians, but that's contrasted with the documented use of human shields. And a humanitarian cause is often talked about, while aid is reportedly diverted for military purposes. Now, according to our source material and international law, this strategy includes a number of documented war crimes. And these aren't just abstract accusations. We're talking about specific, documented tactics, deliberate attacks on civilians, suicide bombings in public places, the use of torture, and, as we've mentioned, taking civilian hostages. It also includes the use of human shields by placing military operations inside protected sites like schools and hospitals. This all leads to the final section of our analysis, which looks at the impact of Hamas's strategy, and not just on Israelis, but on Palestinians too. The analysis within our source material is pretty blunt on this point. It argues that Hamas's actions, by putting armed conflict above all else, actually end up harming the broader Palestinian cause. The argument is that this strategy traps the people of Gaza in a non-stop cycle of violence and prevents any real chance for development or a stable future. And this really gets to the absolute core of the argument presented in these documents, that Hamas's entire power structure is fundamentally tied to perpetual conflict. You see, from this perspective, a lasting peace would actually be an existential threat to the organization, because its whole identity, its entire relevance, is rooted in being a militant group at war. So we don't end with a simple answer. Instead, we're left with a central question that this entire analysis forces us to ask. How do you separate a people's legitimate national aspirations from an organization that, according to these sources, has channeled those very aspirations toward its own violent ideology? That is the incredibly complex challenge at the very heart of this conflict.